Testing, 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 testing. 1, 2, testing. You know, Dwayne was teaching yesterday, and they might have had him on a different channel. Testing, 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 test, test, test. Uh-oh. Oh, I wonder. Yeah. Hey, you know what, Josh? We couldn't get the sound off of the DVD player last night, so we shut a lot of these switches off. Yeah, it's
No, it's not coming on. Is there a main switch?
here. There we go. Testing, testing, test, test. Is that on? Testing. Can you hear that? Testing, testing, test, test. Testing, test, test, test. Testing, 1, 2, test, test, test. Testing, 1, 2, test, test. Testing, test, 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 test. Test. Test, 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 test. Testing. Testing, test, test, test. Testing, test, test, test. Yeah, I know. That's wow. Well, test,
And
test,
then
test.
JJ shut that down up
Oh,
last night. So I don't
testing,
know.
test, 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 test. Wow. Oh, here, this is testing, test, test. Testing, 1, 2, test, 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 test. That's on.
This
And
one's
that's
all shut down.
testing, test, test, test. Testing. Yeah, that's on, right? That's on.
Yeah, that's
Test,
on.
test. Although it's not
Oh,
lit.
no.
There's no lights in there.
Is the zero?
Well, I'm not sure.
I think that's on.
Do you? Test, test, test.
Oh, is that?
Test.
Are you on?
Nothing? Nothing yet. Nada. Okay. Wow. Well, testing, test, test.
So that's on.
Test, 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 test. Well, Josh is up there. Yeah. More than that off.
No. No. It might have been something JJ did.
Yeah.
I mean, not that
Testing, test, test, test. As Samuel grew old, he appointed his sons to be judges over Israel. Joel and Abijah, his oldest sons, held court in Beersheba, but they were not like their father, for they were greedy for money. They accepted bribes and perverted justice. And we said this last week, but how could you have had a more godly father than Samuel? You know, he was the example. And at the same time, Samuel had seen Eli's failure to discipline his sons and how poorly they turned out, how wickedly they turned out. And now Samuel is kind of running in the same direction with his sons. It's really pretty tragic. And we said last week, you know, there's a lesson in that. You will find in 1st Kings, 1st, 2nd Kings, 1st, 2nd Chronicles, good kings with bad sons, bad kings with good sons, bad kings with bad sons, a lot of those. And you will find a few good kings with good sons. So again, just make sure that you're very careful not to judge people that because you're going to expect that their son is going to be no good because the father was no good. You get the point? Don't do that. That's not fair. That's not fair. And then we go on to verse 4 and 5. We pick up for tonight. Finally, the leaders of Israel met at Ramah to discuss the situation with Samuel. They're talking about how bad his sons. Yay, hallelujah, Josh. They're talking about how bad his sons were. There we go. They're talking about how the speakers are echoing. That's better. That works. Okay. They're talking about how wicked his sons are. And then it says in verse 5, look, they told him, they're talking to Samuel. Look, they told him, you are now old, and your sons are not like you. Give us a king, like all the other nations have. Now, the first thing here is Ramah. You can see the location of Ramah. And as we're going to see later in the story, there's reason to believe that this was the most preeminent of all of the cities in Israel. We'll see why that is, but this is in one of the major cities. And they've met there for a big meeting. And it says, the leaders of Israel met at Ramah. All of Israel, 12 tribes, come together. And they say, look, you're old, your sons aren't like you. Give us a king like all the other nations have. Now Israel, you may not know this, but Israel had never had a king. Up until this point, no kings. It went from Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, who went to led them out of Egypt, into Egypt. Then 430 years later, Moses leads them out of Egypt. And you go from Moses to Joshua to the period of the judges, with Samuel being the final judge. So that was their leadership. You had Moses as a model, Joshua as a model. Then the judges came, and the judges there was not always a judge. Like in a monarchy, once a king is established, there's always a king. There's always a king. In the time of the judges, when things were at peace, there was no judge. And sometimes there were, but they would go without a judge. When a disaster would come, when there was a threat, then they would, God would appoint a judge to deliver them. But now they're going to get a king. And why did they not have a king? Why? Well, the reason is that Israel was a theocracy. And that's a form of government. Theo is God, so it means governed by God, theocracy. A democracy is ruled by the people. A monarchy is ruled by a king for life, usually passed down through bloodline. And aristocracy is a Greek word which means the rule of the best, or at least they feel they're the best. So those are different forms of government. And so Israel was a theocracy. So it's interesting as you read the Old Testament and the New Testament, keep in mind that all judicial matters were settled by the priests because it wasn't church and state. There wasn't a church that you'd go to get, to fulfill your religious life. And if you had a legal matter in our society, we take it to a court, a county court. In the Old and New Testament days, under theocracy, there is no separate division of government. Everything is administered by the church in their day. And so they had a lot of power, the priests. But now the people say they want a king. And why do they want to do it? Because they don't like their current king. And you know who their current king is? God, that's right. Look back to 1 Samuel 8. Let me see if that's right. Yeah, that's right. They don't like their current king. 1 Samuel 8, verse 6. Samuel was very upset with their request and went to the Lord for advice. Do as they say, the Lord replied, for it is me they are rejecting, not you. They don't want me to be their king any longer. So there it states that God makes that statement. Verse 8, ever since I brought them from Egypt, they have continually forsaken me and followed other gods. And now they are giving you the same treatment. We could skip past this, but we're not going to, because this is so important as you read the Old Testament. When I became a pastor, I went to family reunion. And a man in my family, an uncle, 80 plus years old, had been a pastor his whole life. Went to seminary out of college and went right into pastorate. And he taught every Sunday morning. He preached every Sunday morning. And he asked me one time at a family reunion what we were teaching on. And it was an Old Testament book. And he looked at me in shock. He said, now he was a Church of the Brethren pastor, and the Church of Brethren is big on New Testament doctrine, teaching, and I get that. But listen to what he said. He said, he's 80 years old, full-time pastor all those years. In all my years, I've never taught one sermon on an Old Testament chapter. Never. Never. And I was amazed. But there are a lot of people that take that line. That we're under the New Covenant, we're under the New Testament, that's for us. The Old Testament was the Old Covenant, that's for the Jews, really doesn't apply to us. There are a lot that take that line. But here's the tragedy then. In the New Testament, it covers an era from maybe 4 AD, 4 BC, whenever Jesus was born. It starts there, and it goes up to about 90 AD, where John is in Patmos and writing the book of Revelation. And so it covers that period of time. So maybe 70 years. And in it, there's a lot of doctrine, but there's not a lot of stories of people's lives. In the Old Testament, you get the cause and effect of sin played out in one generation, under the next, under the next, under the next. You learn a lot of lessons from that. And so the same is true in the Old Testament as it relates to what God says here. He says, listen, verse 8, ever since I brought them from Egypt, they have continually forsaken me and followed other gods. Now, I'd like you to look at some scripture verses here that show you how systemic this sin was, how just it was just who they were. And there's a reason I want to make this point. Look at Acts chapter 7, New Testament. Josh, thank you, by the way, for getting that cleared up. Acts chapter 7. Verse 36. Acts 7:36. This is the stoning of Stephen, and he goes on a long diatribe speaking of the history of Israel. And in verse 36, Stephen says, and by means of many miraculous signs and wonders, he led them out of Egypt through the Red Sea and back and forth through the wilderness for 40 years. And then go to verse 39 of that chapter.
And Stephen says, "But our ancestors rejected Moses and wanted to return to Egypt. They told Aaron, 'Make us some gods who can lead us, for we don't know what has become of this Moses who brought us out of Egypt.' So they made an idol shaped like a calf, and they sacrificed to it and rejoiced in this thing that they had made. Then God turned away from them and gave them up to serve." This is in 40 years in the wilderness. "And gave them up to serve the sun, the moon, the stars as their gods. In the book of the prophets it is written, 'Was it to me you were bringing sacrifices during those 40 years in the wilderness?' No, your real interest was in your pagan gods. The shrine of Molech, that's where they burned children in fire as sacrifices to their god Molech. Your real interest was in your pagan gods, the shrine of Molech, the star Rephan, and the images you made to worship them. So I will send you into captivity far away in Babylon." And the psalmist writes about this as well. It says, "For that full 40 years, your heart was never turned to me." Look at the book of Psalms, Psalm 78. You might want to mark this because this represents God's opinion of the children of Israel during these 40 years. Psalm 78, verse 40. Psalm 78, verse 40. They're talking about looking back at the time when they were in the wilderness. Psalm 78, verse 40. It says, "Oh, how often they rebelled against him in the desert and grieved his heart in the wilderness. Again and again they tested God's patience and frustrated the Holy One of Israel. They forgot about his power and how he had rescued them from their enemies, his wonders on the plain of Zoan." Then look at Psalm 95. Psalm 95, verse 8. Psalm 95, verse 8. It says, "The Lord says, 'Don't harden your hearts as Israel did at Meribah, as they did at Massah in the wilderness. For there,'" again, they're talking about the 40 years in the wilderness, "for there your ancestors tried my patience. They courted my wrath, though they had seen my many miracles." Now listen here. It says, "For 40 years I was angry with them." Not 38, not 35, not 30, not 20, not half, not 3/4. For 40 years I was angry with them. They are a people whose hearts turn away from me. They refuse to do what I tell them. Then look at Psalm 106. Psalm 106, verse 37. Psalm 106, verse 37. It says, "They even sacrificed their sons and their daughters to the demons. They shed innocent blood, the blood of their sons and daughters, by sacrificing them to the idols of Canaan. They polluted the land with murder. They defiled themselves by their evil deeds. Their love of idols was adultery in the Lord's sight. That is why the Lord's anger burned against his people, and he abhorred his special possession." Verse 41, "He handed them over to pagan nations and those who hated and ruled over them," because of that sin. And oh, how God tried, how he tried. Look at Isaiah, which is a right turn from Psalms. Isaiah chapter 42. Isaiah 42, verse 18. Isaiah 42, 18. God tried. Isaiah 42, 18. He says, "Oh, how deaf and blind you are toward me. Why won't you listen? Why do you refuse to see? Who in all the world is as blind as my own people, my servants? Who is as deaf as my messengers? Who is as blind as my chosen people, the servant of the Lord? You see and understand what is right, but you refuse to act on it. You hear, but you don't really listen. Listen to this, verse 21. The Lord has magnified his law and made it truly glorious, though through it he had planned to show the world that he is righteous. But what a sight his people are! For they have been robbed, enslaved, imprisoned, and trapped. They are fair game for all and have no one to protect them. Will not even one of you apply these lessons from the past and see the ruin that awaits you? Who allowed Israel to be robbed and hurt? Was it not the Lord? It was the Lord whom we sinned against. For the people would not go where he sent them, and they would not obey his laws. That is why he poured out such fury on them and destroyed them in battle. They were set on fire and burned, but they still refused to understand. So the point is, when you start really drilling down and studying the Old Testament and the life of the Jews, you will find there are very, very brief windows of time where the people obeyed God. Very brief windows. You know, it's been said, God, throughout all of mankind, through the beginning of time, God has always ruled by law and always saved by grace. He has always ruled by law and saved by grace. Why? Because he had to. Because they never earned it. They never got there. We have been a disobedient, stubborn people from the beginning. They were, we are. They didn't obey, we don't obey. The advantage we have is we have the Holy Spirit living inside of us to prompt us to want to do right. They didn't have that. So just remember that as you read the Bible, that there were very few bright times where the people really, really followed the Lord. There were some, but it was by far the exception. So let's go back now to 1 Samuel 8, and we'll start at 8, and we'll read a little bit here. Verse 7, let's start at verse 7. Let me get the next picture up here. Give us a king. Do as they say, the Lord replied, for it is me they are rejecting, not you. They don't want me to be king any longer. Ever since I brought them from Egypt, they have continually forsaken me and followed other gods. And now they are giving you the same treatment. Do as they ask, but solemnly warn them about how a king will treat them. So Samuel passed on the Lord's warnings to the people. This is how a king will treat you, Samuel said. So these are the leaders standing there in Ramah. Just picture it. Samuel is kind of the leader. He's a priestly leader. He's a governmental leader of sorts. He's the judge. And so they're standing around him. He's older. He has two young sons. They want a king. He says, verse 11, this is how a king will treat you, Samuel said. The king will draft your sons into his army and make them run before his chariots. Some will be commanders of his troops, while others will be slave laborers. Some will be forced to plow in his fields and harvest his crops, while others will make his weapons and chariot equipment. The king will take your daughters from you and force them to cook and bake and make perfumes for him. He will take away the best of your fields and vineyards and olive groves and give them to his own servants. He will take a tenth of your harvest. Oh, if that were just true today. He will take a tenth of your harvest and distribute it among his officials and attendants. He will want your male and female slaves and demand the finest of your cattle and donkeys for his own use. He will demand a tenth of your flocks, and you will be his slaves. When that day comes, you will beg for relief from this king you are demanding, but the Lord will not help you. But the people refused to listen to Samuel's warning. Even so, we want a king, they said. It's interesting. The people don't doubt Samuel's words. They never say, we don't think that's going to happen. They don't say, no, it's not going to be that bad. They never doubt it. What they say is, even so, we want a king. And why? The answer is found in verse 20. It says, we want to be like the nations around us. Our king will govern us and lead us into battle. We want to be like the nations around us. Our king will govern us and lead us into battle. You know, up until now, the style of government was pretty ideal. Every family was autonomous. They ran their own show. under the leadership of a team of elders in that family. There was not one central authority within Israel. The closest it came to was a judge. But apart from that, there was no structure. There were no congressmen, senators, anything like that. Each tribe autonomous, ruled by their own elders of that tribe. But under a king, Samuel says, the king is going to conscript your sons into battle. He's going to requisition your crops. He's going to make some of you, the men, make weapons for him, and some women perfume makers. I thought it interesting, perfume makers, and I take that to mean that he was signifying that the king's going to live a pretty cushy life, and your wives are going to end up making perfume for his many wives. That's where you're headed. And taxation, which had been unknown to this point, would begin at 10%, and in the decades to follow, it would grow to be oppressive. Now, Saul is the king that's going to get appointed here. He's the first king. The second king is going to be who? David. The third king is going to be Solomon. After the second king, after Solomon, the third king, things were bad. Make a right turn to 1 Kings 12. 1 Kings 12. This shows you how bad the taxes had gotten. It's interesting. You don't hear this complaint while Solomon's alive. Only after he dies. 1 Kings 12, verse 3. This is when Rehoboam was going to be crowned as king. Let's start at verse 1. 1 Kings 12:1. Rehoboam, who was Solomon's son, Solomon's now dead, went to Shechem, where all Israel had gathered to make him king. When Jeroboam, son of Nebat, this rebel guy, heard of Solomon's death, he returned to Egypt, for he had fled to Egypt to escape from Solomon. The leaders of Israel sent for Jeroboam, the heir apparent, and the whole assembly of Israel went to speak with Rehoboam. Listen, your father, Solomon, your father was a hard master, they said. Lighten the harsh labor demands and heavy taxes that your father imposed upon us. Then we will be your loyal subjects. So from just Saul to David to Solomon, by the time Solomon had died, the people were being crushed by taxes that the kings had put upon them. And Samuel says that. Samuel says until the people would become virtually slaves of the state. But even so, they say they want a king. And so God says, they want a king, give them a king. And 2 weeks ago, I said that Solomon could not have been God's plan A. And someone challenged me in that. And my response would just answer this question. David had to kill Uriah to get the mother of Solomon. How could that have been God's plan A? It couldn't have been his plan A. And they said, but he was such a good king, it worked out so well. Oh, God's plans are never thwarted by man's disobedience. He always has a plan B, a plan C, plan D. But it wouldn't have been as good as his plan A. Listen, it's really good for you to think about that when you read the Bible, study the Old Testament. For instance, I suspect, you may start throwing things at me for this. I suspect, it may have been God's will for Saul to be the first king and Jonathan to be the second king. Jonathan was an amazing man. Read the life of Jonathan. Now, people say, well, where does that leave David? You know, David could not have been God's plan A. Impossible. You know why? Because it was not God's plan A for Israel to ever have a king, right? He didn't want Israel to have a king. That wasn't God's plan A. Plan A, no king. David was a king. Do you get it? You can't have both. You can't have no king and have a king. God's plan was not to have a king. But David was a wonderful king, a man after God's own heart. Yes. Wonderful thing. Doesn't mean God didn't love David. All I'm saying is he could not have been in God's plan A. Maybe he would have showed up as I don't know. Do you get my point? So it's important when you read the Bible, you think about that, because there are a lot of times where that comes up. And you can get a little sideways in that. So let's go on. 1 Samuel 8, verse 21. It says, so Samuel told the Lord what the people had said, and the Lord replied, do as they say and give them a king. Then Samuel agreed and sent the people home. So the people go home happy, and God goes home sad. And Samuel goes home sad. Now here's a takeaway for us. And here's a prayer to explain it. This is how I think we should pray. God, give me a heart that rejoices in what you rejoice in, that rejoices in what you want, and give me a heart that breaks for what breaks your heart instead of what breaks mine. God, give me a heart that rejoices in what you rejoice in and breaks for what your heart breaks over. Because had they prayed that prayer, they would not have wanted a king. They would have wanted what God wanted. So be very careful when you find yourself rejoicing in what the people around you, the people of the world rejoice in, without first checking to see what God's position is on that subject. Because we can start rejoicing over things, and it feels very natural to us and good with us, and the crowd is applauding and cheering and yelling, hooray, hooray, hooray. And we get caught up in that, but we never really stop to check what God's opinion would be in that subject. And that's an important lesson. Now, let's go on. They're going to get their king. 1 Samuel 9. It says, Kish is Saul's father. Kish was a rich, influential man from the tribe of Benjamin. He was the son of Abiel, the grandson of Zeror from the family of Berechath, and the clan of Aphiah. So, one of the commentators said, there's that golden calf, give us a king, give us a king. One of the commentators said, that's the people, let me get this. This is the tribe of Benjamin, and you can see the little tribe of Benjamin. You see Judah in the green. Benjamin is right above that. So that is the tribe that Saul is going to be from, and his father, Kish. Commentator said that Kish's long genealogy testifies to a family of importance in Benjamin because it lists 4 generations of genealogy, and they said that should make that point. And verse 1 says he was an influential man. Another translation says a man of standing. Hebrew, it literally means a powerful man, a man of strength, a man of might, a man of wealth. So that was Saul's father. And the use of this phrase in conjunction with the fact that he, in the fact discovered in 11:5 that Kish owned slaves and donkeys and oxen, suggests that Kish, commentator said, was, I would say maybe was, one of the most influential families in Benjamin. So this Saul is coming from a well-connected, wealthier family, and that's his background. And do you remember who else was from the tribe of Benjamin? Very good, Paul. Go to Philippians 3. Boy, you were on the gun on that one, man. That was great. You had your finger on the trigger, ready to look at Philippians 3, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians 3, verse 4. And Paul's bragging about it. He says, Philippians 3, 4, yet I could have confidence in myself if anyone could. If others have reason for confidence in their own efforts, I have even more. So he's going to say here that what he's going to list show that he's above other Jews who would brag about their backgrounds. He said, I was circumcised when I was 8 days old, having been born into a pure-blooded Jewish family. That is a branch of the tribe of Benjamin. That was a bragging right to Paul. And they say they believe the reason it was because it was the tribe that the first king came from. So that was Paul's background as well. And then go on to the next verse. Chapter 9, verse 2. It says, his son Saul was the most handsome man in Israel, head and shoulders taller than anyone else in the land. Now, why does that matter? Why does it matter that why would God pick a guy that was tall and handsome? You say to me, we just learned something different than that. Or we're going to learn. Look at 1 Samuel 16. You know where this is going, probably. Some of you do. 1 Samuel 16, verse 6. 1 Samuel 16, verse 6. This is when Samuel goes to anoint David. Remember the story? Jesse, his father, lines up all of his sons. He keeps bringing them out. The oldest, and the next oldest, and the next oldest, and the next oldest. And Samuel says, oh, this must be the guy. Look how handsome he is. Look at this guy. This is the king. And God says, nope, wrong guy. Next. Nope, next. Nope, next. Nope, next. And they get all the way down to David. But in the process of that, God says this. 1 Samuel 16, verse 6. It says, when they arrived, Samuel took one look at Eliab and thought, surely this is the Lord's anointed. But the Lord said to Samuel, don't judge by the appearance or height, for I have rejected him. The Lord doesn't make decisions the way you do. People judge by outward appearance. The Lord looks at a person's thoughts and intentions. But this is the opposite of that. Here he picks this guy because he's handsome and he's taller than any other man in Israel. Why is that? God's going against his own law, his own rule. Well, look at 1 Samuel 8, verse 5. It explains why. It says, give us a king like all the other nations have. And that's what he gave him. You want a king like the nations have? The big, the strong, the handsome? It's not that far different from elections today, is it? You know? That all plays a part in that scene. We don't, never mind, I'm going to get in trouble. So that is what they will get. Not a king. They're not going to get a king with the right heart, as we're going to see later. So this choice, listen, this choice of Saul really was an indictment against Israel by God. It really was. So let's move on. Verse 3 to 5. 9, 3 to 5. It says, one day Kish's donkeys strayed away, and he told Saul, his son, take a servant with you and go look for them. So Saul took one of his servants and traveled through the hill country of Ephraim, the land of Shalishah, the Shalem area, and the entire land of Benjamin. The entire land of Benjamin. You see that little land there. But they couldn't find the donkeys anywhere. Finally, they entered the region of Zuph, and Saul said to his servant, let's go home. By now my father would be more worried about us than about the donkeys. Now, one commentator made this point. It says this, Saul's unfitness to serve as the shepherd of the Lord's flock is further suggested in the unusual narrative recounted here. Semitic leaders throughout ancient times were often referred to as shepherds. The Torah's most significant patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses, were all skillful shepherds. Yet here, Saul is portrayed unflatteringly as an incompetent shepherd. And he's going to shepherd Israel. So great was his ineptness that he could not even find a few very large animals that had wandered away from his father's house, ones that ultimately returned home without Saul's assistance, even as he was searching for them, with the aid of a slave. Saul searched extensively in the territory of Benjamin and southern Ephraim, including the area of Shalishah, of regions probably 20 miles or less from Gibeah, Saul's hometown. So already he's inept as a shepherd. And after a frustrating 3-day search, and what does the number 3 mean? Do you remember? Anybody? Good. Enough to make... Who said that? 3 of you. Enough to make the point. Look at that. Yeah, 3 means enough to make the point. Enough to make the point that you don't have to go further to 4 or 5 or 6. 3 makes the point it would have happened again. Jesus prayed in the garden 3 times. Paul prayed that the thorn would be removed 3 times. 3 times Peter denied Jesus, meaning he would have done it the 4th, the 5th, the 6th, the 7th. 3 times. It's over and over and over in the Bible. When you hit the number 3, remember that. It's enough to make the point. And the point is here. 3 days. Enough to make the point. They wouldn't have found them. They wouldn't have found them. And so after a frustrating 3 days, guess who thinks of a plan? Look at 1 Samuel 9:6. It says, but his servant said, I've just thought of something. There's a man of God here who lives in this town. He is held in high honor by all the people because of everything he says comes true. Let's go find him. Perhaps he can tell us which way we should go. So, who thinks of the plan? His servant, not Saul. You get this picture that Saul goes around kind of, I don't know. What do you think? What do you think, servant? Yeah, let's do that. Yeah. They want a king. He's going to give them a king. It's very telling. Broad shoulders, big head, small brain. Reminds me of dinosaurs. We were just out at the Creation Museum. Those dinosaurs, big animals, big shoulders, little brain. We got dinosaur Saul here. But they have a problem. In verse 7, it says, but we don't have anything to offer him, Saul replied. Even our food is gone, and we don't have a thing to give him. Well, the servant said, I have 1 small silver piece. We can at least offer it to him and see what happens. Again, the servant has a plan. In those days, if people wanted a message from God, they would say, let's go and ask the seer. For prophets used to be called seers. All right, Saul agreed. Let's try it. Okay. All right, Saul agreed. Let's try it. So they started into the town where the man of God was. And this is, again, interesting. The servant is better at managing his money than Saul is managing his. The servant has some cash. Saul has nothing. His wallet is empty. He spent it on the lottery that day. You know, there's a lesson here, a big lesson in business. You never want to promote someone in a position to manage your business if they can't manage their own money. That is the mistake of mistakes. That's why in certain positions you want to get a credit rating. Because, listen, it tells the picture. In certain positions, I wouldn't put a person in without getting a credit rating. Because it's going to tell me a lot. I don't care what they tell me. I want to see how they live. Okay? And he can't. Now, here's the really interesting part. It says, I have a small silver piece. It was a small silver piece. The commentator said a quarter of a shekel is approximately 3 grams of silver. Today, I looked it up, 1 gram of silver is 89 cents. That means that his servant pulled $2.67 out of his wallet. $2.67. They're going to go and offer this to the prophet to tell him where the donkeys are. A whopping $2.67. And verse 10, they say, let's go find the man of God. What a title. The man of God. Wouldn't it be interesting in your life to go back and think back through the history? Some of you don't have a Christian history. You're maybe first-generation Christians. You never lived around Christians growing up. Maybe you're only entering into that world right now. But some of you have had a rich Christian background. It would be interesting for you to go back and think back through who of all of those people you knew and respected in that arena would you today say that was a man of God? That was a woman of God? I could come up with a list. And they were. They were men of God. They were women of God. And you know what? You didn't have to be with them long to figure that out. You really didn't. The character was obvious, evident. Like I said, when you find those people, they have roots that go down 20 feet. Nothing knocks them over. That's just who they are. So they say in verse 10, it says, all right, Saul agreed, let's try it. So they started into the town where the man of God was. If someone came to your town and they said, is there a man of God in this town? I wonder who they'd go get. Is there a man of God in this town? I'm way behind in pictures here. Oh, there, he's heads and shoulders taller than anyone else. And then it says, verse 11, as they were climbing a hill toward the town, they met some young women coming out to draw water. So Saul and his servant asked, is the seer here today? Yes, they replied. Stay right on this road. He's at the town gates. He has just arrived to take part in a public sacrifice up on the hill. Hurry and catch him before he goes up the hill to eat. The guests won't start until he arrives to bless the food. And so there are, I want to say this, I should have said this before I read that. There are three remarkable things found here in Saul's conversation with the servant. Number one is Saul's profound ignorance of Samuel. The servant knows more about him than Saul does. He knows that he's a man of God. He knows that he's a seer. Saul doesn't even know that. He's completely ignorant to that. He doesn't know anything about him. Secondly, and Saul lived nearby. It was known to all of, in chapter 3:20, it says that it was known, quote, to all of Israel that Samuel spoke for God, and even Saul's servant knew it, but Saul did not. Why? My guess is that he was completely uninterested in spiritual things. That's my guess. You want a king like the nations? That's not too far off the mark, is it? Zero interest in spiritual things? The second thing we discover is Saul's failure to seek help from Jehovah in the trials of life. Listen, when they couldn't find the donkey, they never prayed. They never prayed. The second thing we see is Saul's failure to seek help from Jehovah. He never prayed. And you know, this isn't in my notes, but it just hit me. You know what gets Saul in trouble? He doesn't pray. Going forward, you're going to see that. It gets him in trouble. What he didn't know in early life, he didn't have to apply in later life. But his servant recognized they needed divine help. Hey, there's a seer. There's a prophet. Let's go see him. Oh, okay, let's go. Third is Saul thought that a true prophet of God worked for money. Let's pay him. If we have enough money, we can get the right words out, like the Buddha Tao, rub his belly and the answer comes out of his mouth. You know, there have been numerous times where in the church I've done different things for different people. Maybe I've anointed them for healing, or maybe I've gone to a house to bless it, and they get their wallet out and say, how much do I owe you? And I say no. And I don't make a big deal about it because I don't want to make them feel bad. But, we're not for hire. We're not for hire. And he didn't know that. He didn't know that. Now, it says that these girls are coming to draw water. This suggests that they arrived, Saul and his servant arrived in Ramah at early evening, just prior to sundown, because that's when women would go out to get water, at the evening, just prior to sundown. Bergen, the commentator, says this: timeless social customs in the Middle East prevented men from having much contact with women in public, but women were permitted to speak even with total strangers under the circumstances presented here. And we see that numerous places, actually, where in the Old Testament, when Abraham's servant goes to find a wife for Isaac, he meets women at the well. Same thing with Jacob. And so they say he's at the city gates. Now, if you've ever been to Israel, you get to go to Israel, or cities typically, the first gate that you would come into, the main gate, was called the city gate. And in the city gate, and that's not a drawing, that is, we've been here, I think this is Tel Dan. But they've actually built out of wood what the city gate would look like. And so the men of the city, the elders of the city, the rulers of the city, would come to the city gates many times in the morning, or when they were called. If you saw the movie Ruth last night, they met at the city gate to make a decision about Ruth and her possession under Boaz. So the men would sit in those alcoves there, and people would come to do business. They'd come and ask questions. They'd come to settle disputes, settle matters. And so that's where Samuel is. Now it's reconstructed on the left side, on the right side. Here is another one where you can really see it clearly. So people would come in through those city gates. And they say from there that Samuel is going to take part in a public sacrifice up in the hill. Now, you might say, I thought that Jews can only sacrifice in one place, in Jerusalem. And what I said was, David didn't conquer Jerusalem yet. So they had Shiloh before this. But what happened to Shiloh? It was destroyed, right? It was conquered by the Philistines. And so what they believe is, and that's what I said earlier, that's why they think that Ramah was such a large central city, because this is the city where sacrifices were held. Of all the cities, this is the city that they moved Shiloh to. One commentator said, quote, this apparently had become the local substitute for the required worship center that had been at Shiloh. And this evening sacrifice would have taken place at sundown. Let's go into chapter 9, verse 14. It says, so they entered the city gate, the city town. So the servant and Saul entered the town, and as they passed through the gates, Samuel was coming out toward them to climb the hill. Now the Lord had told Samuel the previous day, about this time tomorrow, I will send you a man from the land of Benjamin. Anoint him to be the leader of my people Israel. He will rescue them from the Philistines, for I have looked down on my people in mercy and have heard their cry. When Samuel noticed Saul, the Lord said, that's the man I told you about. He will rule my people. You know, I never thought about this till right now, but who came first, David or Saul? Saul. And the first pick that God makes is a tall, good-looking guy, right? So it does make sense when he goes to find David that he's looking for the same model, right? A tall, good-looking guy. That's why he picked Eliab. That's why he picked all the others. Why he wouldn't have picked David. And that's where God straightened him out. Man's pick, tall, strong. My pick, I go for the heart. I go for the heart. And you know, this isn't in my notes, but it's really worth making the point. You know, if God has called you to ministry, there's not a single attribute that any of you lack that's going to keep you from being called into the ministry that God wants to call you to. I've said this before. I will never be drafted by the NBA. Does that surprise anybody? Yeah. I'm 5'9". I'm not sure what I am. It keeps going down a little bit a year. But I'll never be drafted. And believe it or not, I know it's hard to believe, the NFL has never called me to play for one of their teams either. See, I lack what it takes physically to be in those particular fields. That will never be the case for you in ministry. There's nothing that you lack that God can't make up for. In fact, more than make up for. In fact, he gets a bigger bang out of the buck when you don't have it, and he does it through you. Did you get it? I'm prime example. I should never be a pastor. I don't know how I got to be a pastor. I love being one. Someday you're going to figure out I shouldn't be, and you're going to come out of the ether and say, why did we settle for him all these years? But while it's going on, I'm enjoying myself. But there's nothing that's going to hold you back from being what God wants you to be. And so let's see. Where was I there? Okay, let's go into verse 14. We did do that. Yeah, this is the man I told you about. Now, verse 17, it says, when Samuel noticed Saul, the Lord said, that's the man I told you about. He will rule my people. The word, it says, and not rule, the Hebrew word for rule here, he will rule my people. There's irony in this because the word that's used for rule in Hebrew is the word atsar, A-S-A-R, atsar. And it means restrain, hold back, hinder, imprison. So when it says he will rule my people, in Hebrew what it's saying is he will restrain my people, he will hold back my people, he will hinder my people, he will imprison my people. In 46 times that it's used in the Old Testament, the majority of the times it's used in a negative way, intending to imply imprisonment, sterility, silencing, or holding back. So by employing this verb here, let me get the right picture up. Oh, that picture didn't take. By employing this verb here, it is showing that God was going to use Saul as a means of punishing Israel. Again, Bergen says this. He says, emblematic of Saul's spiritual blindness is his initial encounter with Samuel. Though Samuel was the most famous and honored spiritual leader in Israel since the time of Moses, when Saul looked at him, he only saw a stranger. The contrast between Saul and Samuel is striking. Samuel, the man of spiritual insight, the seer, knew all about this young, obscure man even before he met him. Saul, the paragon of spiritual blindness, knew nothing of the most famous man in Israel, even after he encountered him. The narrative motif of Saul's incapacity to see the true nature of people would later be expressed in the context of his relationship with Jonathan, David, and Ahimelech. He would misjudge his son Jonathan to be an unworthy son and a traitor. He deemed David to be a treacherous revolutionary, and Ahimelech a co-conspirator against the throne. All of these misreadings of others resulted in tragedy both for Saul and for others. A very poor judge of character. And then look at verse 18. It says, just then Saul approached Samuel at the gateway and asked, can you please tell me where the seer's house is? Saul doesn't know he's talking to Samuel. Can you please tell me where the seer's house is? By coincidence, he ends up right in front of Samuel. I am the seer, Samuel replied. Go on up the hill ahead of me to the place of sacrifice, and we'll eat there together. In the morning I will tell you what you want to know and send you on your way. And don't worry about those donkeys that were lost 3 days ago, for they have been found. And I'm here to tell you, listen to this, and I'm here to tell you that you and your family are the focus of all of Israel's hopes. Saul got more than he asked. What did he ask of the seer? Do you know where the seer's house is? He didn't even say where the donkeys are. He didn't know he was talking to the seer. The only question he asked was this strange man, do you know where the seer's house is? He got a lot more than he asked. Instead, it's Samuel, and Samuel, he's introduced to Samuel, the seer. He's invited to dine with the seer, and he's told that the donkeys have been recovered. And then that's where we're going to stop. But we have a lot of good stuff coming. And, Saul is a brilliant object lesson on how God can choose somebody without talents and abilities. And after they get a couple victories, they get filled with pride and God abandons them. And I've said this before. If you think about it, if God can use anybody, and he can, if he doesn't need your natural ability or your intelligence or your smarts, if he can use anybody, and he can, because again, the least likely servant gets God the most glory. If he can use anybody,
then what does he use? What criteria does he use to determine who he's going to pick? Because it isn't based on talents and abilities and intellect. That means nothing to God. So what is it? He wants to pick somebody that when God starts using them, they're not going to jump in front and say, look what I did, look what I did, look what I did. Because when that happens, he abandons them. You know what Saul was doing when Samuel went to find him to tell him God was done with him? He was going to erect a monument to himself. That's kind of telling. So again, as we go forward with the story, just keep that in mind. He starts out kind of humble, but once God starts using him, he goes south fast. It's tragic. Let's close in prayer. Father, I do pray that we would learn from this, Lord. The New Testament says that the whole Bible is an ensample to us, an example to us, to learn not to make the mistakes that those who made mistakes made, and to do those things that the godly people in the Old Testament did, that we'd follow their example and not follow these bad examples. So, Lord, help us to do more than just enjoy this as a story, but that we would lock these learnings away, that they would help us to be more Christ-like. We love you, Lord, and we pray this in Jesus' name, and all of God's people said, Amen. Thanks for coming tonight. Hey, and we will not meet next Monday because it's Labor Day. So we'll see you in 2 weeks. Memorial Day. Yes, I'm ahead of myself. God bless you all. Thanks.